Okay, welcome back. If you watched the sorting tutorial I put up 2 weeks ago now, you will recognize this lovely little flower. And what we are going to look at doing today, we're just going to continue with one of the same photographs from the previous tutorial, and we're going to pull it into Bridge and look at how to just do some very basic adjustments and editing in Bridge. This is the next step I take in my personal process. So 2 weeks ago when we went through the sorting process, that's my sorting process. This is the next step in my own editing process. Works great for some people. It may not be your cup of tea, but yeah, that's okay. Hopefully it will be helpful either way. So the first thing we're going to do is open this in Adobe Bridge. The Adobe Bridge editor. Sorry, we are already technically in Bridge. So I'm going to double click on that. Look down here and make sure it's actually launching. Okay, perfect. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so you double click down on that film strip on whichever one you want to edit, and it's going to bring it up in this funny looking thing. This is the Photoshop/Bridge raw editor. I like it a lot. It's non-destructive editing, meaning that after you open it, if you want to go back and make some of the basic adjustments again or change a few things, you can without destroying pixels, which is wonderful. I love that. You can do these same adjustments in Lightroom. I personally don't like the setup quite as well. Lightroom is really useful and I use it for different things, but for editing I use Bridge. But you can do this in Lightroom if you're a Lightroom person. So, the first thing we are going to point out here, if you're kind of new to this, is the histogram. This shows us kind of how the lights and darks are playing out, and it shows us if there's any clipping. Clipping is where either information is too dark and it's being lost, or it's too bright from a blowout and is being lost. So the way you tell if you have any clipping going on is you look up here in these little arrows. Now, this one's black, which means there's no clipping happening, nothing's blowing out. This side's for the highlights, the right side. The left side's for the shadows. And this is arrows blue, which means there is some clipping happening. Now, in order to see where that's happening, you click on that little arrow right there, and it outlines it in white. Now, wherever it's happening here, it is not anywhere visible, so which means we are okay there. And I'm actually going to do something. Now, if I were to make it really dark and then see how the histogram changed up here, and that arrow went to white, and all those blue spots, when you click on the arrow, shows you where the clipping's happening. That's where it's too dark for any information to come through. So that's just an example for how clipping works. We're going to undo that because that's not what we want. Okay, so if I turn the black all the way down, the little clipping there was is gone, which is good. We want that. We want all the information we can get. Excuse me. So take a look at your white balance. I always keep mine as shot and adjust it manually. You can use these. So like you could set it to auto. That becomes way too cold for my liking. Set it to daylight, which actually is truer. I do like that. Set it to cloudy. If you have not already done this in camera, depending on what your lighting is, you can change it here. I'm going to go with as shot because I actually like it as it was shot. If I want to, I can change my temperature. I can make it cooler and take out a lot of those yellows. I'm going to extremes just to show you what the changes do. I can make it warmer and add in a lot of yellow, but I don't want to do any of that. And you can also do it by typing the number there, and our original number was that. The tint works kind of the same way, so I can add some red tinting, again going to extremes just to show you what changes. Lots of greens. It's pretty straightforward. And again, I'm going to fix that by typing it in. Okay, but I'm actually pretty happy with the white balance for what I was going for when I shot this. Something else you can do is if something comes out too dark or too light, you can adjust your exposure with this slider right here, exposure slider. And I mean, you can make it really bright, which we don't want, or really dark, which we don't want also. So I'm going to put it right back at 0 because I'm actually happy with exposure. If I wanted to make it a little brighter, I could just eye up it by fives. I start with 0.5 and then go up to 10. Otherwise, you end up with blowouts. And always watch your histogram up here when you are adjusting your exposure to make sure that no clipping's happening. We could safely, according to the histogram, probably take that up to 20. And that brightens it up a little bit. So let's leave it like that, see how things are moving slightly up here. The more toward the center you have it, the better, technically. Recovery, if you turn that all the way up, what it does, it restores shadows and darker areas that might have been washed out during your other adjustments with temperature, tint, and exposure, all of that. They do get washed out. Recovery is nice. You can see it's just making slight differences here. And for this particular photograph, I'm not going to bring it up all the way. I'm just going to bring it up a little bit to help kind of balance out some blowouts that could happen potentially here. Fill light does exactly what it sounds like. It brings up the fill light, not your main light. So all that background light, it brings it up, and your histogram's going to give you a huge arch of light. We don't need that though. I like to bump the fill light up a little bit sometimes, but in this case, I'm actually going to leave it all the way down because I want something actually kind of darker. Blacks do, you probably guess it, kind of with the exactly what it sounds like. It brings up all the blacks. So there's that at 100%. It's really extreme. You could play around with that. Again, it depends on what you are going for. And there's without the blacks. I like a lot of contrast. I actually tend to like darker things, but beware if you're pulling up your blacks a little bit, you might also want to pull out your fill light to help with some clipping. Because see, I pulled up the blacks and now we're back to clipping. But the important thing is, where's the clipping happening? I push the arrow, it's not actually showing you any of those blue dots in our area, and more importantly, in the subject. If it's clipping back here in the background, it's not a big deal. That's not where we're looking at. We're looking at this flower. So as long as there's no clipping there, I'm actually going to pull it up a little bit. Still not seeing any blue warning areas. Cool. Okay. So I'm going to leave it at 12. I personally like it a lot. Again, like I said, I have a penchant for darker exposures. Okay, so I'm going to turn my clipping warning off. It's blue, but it's not anywhere in the subject, and it's not losing any information where it's important. So we're okay. Brightness does exactly what it sounds like. It does what the blacks do for highlights. If we brought it all the way up, it would be really bright. We don't want that though. So kinda, you don't want your histogram's too flat. I also don't want it too dark. So I'm gonna drag that back up to, come on, 50. Right there. And if you want to see the changes, what you're making, how it's affecting it, you can go up here and uncheck the preview. There is the original. This is our edit. A little more contrasty. You can see just some minor changes. I'm one of those people that the less change that needs to happen, the better. Contrast does exactly what it sounds like. Again, I like contrasty things, but beware that when you pull it up, watch the histogram up here. I pulled contrast all the way up, and now we have more clipping. It's very contrasty, but this is what it does to our histogram. So whatever you're doing with these sliders, make sure you pay attention and kind of use your histogram as a guide. Alright, so and then if you, as the counter point, if you pull the contrast all the way down, it really flattens out the colors. So I use the contrast slider as a last resort. I kind of set things up manually like you just saw. Clarity, unless it's a really special situation, I set at 10. Vibrance, I also set at 10. Like this, and then saturation should be pretty. Vibrance is how vibrant everything looks. Saturation is how much color is going to saturate here. So if I usually set that at 5. And just to give you an idea, here's clarity all the way up, and here's clarity all the way down. See how it gets kind of fuzzy and soft? I am not a fan of that, but you know, too sharp and you start to skew some pixels, so I usually set my clarity at 10. Vibrance, again, if I pull it all the way up, it's mostly happening back there in the rock where it's changing kind of funny colors. It's going to bump your colors all the way up. And if you take vibrance down, it's going to take all the color vibrance away. So I usually set that at 10 so things aren't just completely unrealistic because we don't want that. Saturation, if you pull it all the way down, it takes all your color away. If you put it all the way up, it adds all the color. So I have that at 5. I feel like those my numbers are basically my rule. There's always some exceptions, but it's where I start. So now I'm going to go to lens correction. And before I crop a photo, I always do a lens correction first, and I will show you why. So I always turn on and label lens profile corrections. If you're freaking out because you don't know what that means, it's okay. If you click on make, it shows you all these different brands that you have. So go check out your camera, see what brand of either camera or lens. If you have a camera where the lenses come off, a professional camera, you're going to want to go with the lens. I actually use a Tamron. This was shot with my 90mm Tamron macro lens, so I'm going to do that. Once you put in the make, it should detect the model and profile. And so what that does, all lenses distort things a little bit. Again, if you want to see what's happening in this pane, it will show you what you've changed just in this pane over here. It's not going to go all the way back to the beginning. So the difference is, you see that little bit distortion, it's taking care of that. I always go to manual. I always turn fringing on. Fringing, if you've ever taken a photograph and around the edges you see strange red or green or yellow or blue lines, that's called fringing. It's related to your shutter speed. There's not any happening here, which is nice. But if there were, you would use these little sliders. You could fix your red, you could fix your cyan. You would slide it until those fringes went away as much as possible. And if you do that, I would always zoom in to 100% in order to make that happen. Okay, yay, no fringes. The way you zoom in and out, as a side note, on my Mac, if you hit the space bar and the option key, it lets you zoom out. If you hit space bar and the command key, it lets you zoom in. And it should work for Alt and Control on Windows. It's been a long time since I've done it on Windows, so. But the reason you want to do your lens profile first is because when it undistorts things, it can actually affect what would appear in your crop. Now, I tend, if you go up here to this little guy right here, mouse over it, it'll say crop tool. Cool. Click on the arrow. Nope, come on. I have issues with this drop-down menu all the time. I'm terrible at selecting it. There you go. Click on it, and if you hold it down, this comes up. I do my own custom crops. I want to crop this one. Depending on the photograph, I usually crop to 24 by 18. I'm writing it for print. This one, I'm actually probably only going to print it as a 16 by 20. So, you always want to do your width first, depending on your orientation. And 16. And I do inches, again, because I'm writing this for print. So, I back it up so I can see where I start and end. And it's going to keep it all in proportion for you. It's going to constrain it all really nicely. Okay. There we go. It's all cropped. Now, after I crop, I always zoom it into 100% because you are cutting out some information, so that information is no longer considered part of the 100%. Now, we talked about soft edges. I've shot this flower. Oh, don't do that. I've shot this flower before, and the edges do come out really soft because of the state of the flower. And sometimes this happens where you crop it and you zoom it into 100 and things are not as sharp as you want. It does happen. But these guys, which are the main subject of the flower, are actually, look at the front ones, not you, up here. Like this one. These guys are pretty good. So we're going to keep that for now for the sake of finishing up this editing. Okay, now that that's done, I head over to sharpening. Yay! Alright, so if you watch the sorting tutorial, I did make a comment that one of the struggles of digital photography is that a lot of cameras struggle with getting things tack sharp because we're working with pixels, and because pixels are technically small digital blips, they tend to round out edges, and so we are constantly struggling with the edges being sharp. Soft! Despite being sharp in your lens when you actually take the photograph. So, if something looks really sharp in your lens, as this flower did in mine, and you come home and you're like, oh, look at that, it's all nice and soft, there are some things you can do. But as a rule, I would say always get it as sharp as you can in camera. And if you have a camera that lets you zoom in to 100% after you've taken a photograph, check it there. That way you need to retake it or not. But for the sake of hurrying this along, so for sharpening, I always zoom into 100% because really scary things can happen when you sharpen my bobbers like this. There we go. And it's really these guys in front here. These guys in the background, they are fine being soft. But if you're not in at 100%, strange things will happen and you won't notice until you have strange pixelized bit on your photograph. So, now that we're at 100, if you hold down the Alt key or the Option key, and you then take this slider, this is the amount you're going to sharpen it, and it turns to black and white. The reason it does this is because black and white allows you to see edges and details without the distraction of color. It's very nice. So I always do this, and the amount, you don't want to go too crazy because then you get those weird bits of things that they over sharpen pixels, and if you've ever seen that, it's scary. So I usually go for about 35, partially because I also have another sharpening technique I use later on. Radius is kind of one of those funny things. The radius, if you have a bunch of lines that need sharpening in a picture, like we do, you're actually going to pull it down. I never go under 0.5. If you have just a few lines in a picture, if it's pretty smooth, or if it's like a landscape, you would want to go up to 1. But usually, generally speaking, you're not going to pull it below 0.5 or above 1 because it will make little strange pixel halos and it makes your subject look almost radioactive. So we have a lot of lines, so I'm going to pull it down to 0.5. Detail, you're going to pull up the detail. Again, this is something you want to be really careful with because it can cause strange aberrations to appear. And it may not look like a lot's happening with the black and white, but if you pulled it all the way up, you see all the grainy stuff that's set up. I let it go, sorry. Push that back down. See all the grain that suddenly appears? We don't want the whole background to be extra sharp. We just want our main subject to be sharp. So we're going to pull that up to 35. Now, masking is cool. I love masking. Because as you pull it up, you see how the black areas get darker and those white lines pop out? Like I just said, we don't want the background to be extra sharp. That's not what we're going for here. So the black areas will actually not be sharpened. And I just really want the edges of these pieces sharpened, and so I'm going to pull that up so it's mostly the whites that I'm seeing. Those are all the edges of those little flower pinions. And that's what I want to be sharp. I don't need the background to be really sharp. I don't even need the inner parts of the flowers to be extra sharp. I want the edges to be really sharp. So that's what that does. If you want to see the difference, it's really subtle, but it's there. So especially if you watch this line right here, if I turn off the preview, you can see how things kind of soften out. And then the next thing I'm going to do is come down here to noise reduction. So noise happens Let's see, it's in this background. It's those little spots. Partially because the background's out of focus. It's supposed to be out of focus. But to kind of help smooth that over, we're going to come down here to the luminance, and instead of messing with the slider, I just type in 50. And if you'll notice a lot of that noise in the background, it went away. But again, if I hit the Alt key and hold down my masking, my edges are still sharp. And in fact, I can actually pull this down and sharpen them a little more. So the less masking you have, everything will be sharp. The more masking you have, only what appears, I keep forgetting I can't do that, only what appears in white will be sharpened. So now if I turn off the preview, all that noise comes back, and there we go. Alright, so let's back this up now because I want to look at the whole thing. Alright. There you can do other things in Bridge. You can apply tone curves and all of that. I actually prefer to do that in Photoshop. We'll go over that a little bit. You can do convert to grayscale here. There are a few processes where you have to do that, but I don't recommend it unless you are using one of those. You can also control saturation, luminance, and all of that. You can tint things with hues. Again, I tend not to do that so much unless I'm using some very specific process. Split toning, it's one of those things I use it for my infrared conversion, and that's about all I use it for in Bridge. But it is there, it is useful depending on what you're doing, but it goes a little beyond the basic editing that we're looking at today. We just went through lens corrections, both on manual. Defringe, we have nothing to fringe. I don't apply lens vignetting here. You can. It's that, see how the edges get darker or brighter? Okay. But the reason I don't do it is because I have a different program that plugs in my Photoshop. And at the moment, I don't want it to clutter up this photo. There are some special effects for grain. Again, I have a secondary program that I feel handles that a little better, but if you did want to add grain, you could add grain. And then if you look at camera calibration, you can choose your camera profile. I have an Adobe standard set up on mine. And you also want to choose your current process. This is more messing with your camera, and this is set up perfectly for mine, so I'm not going to change anything. But if you needed to, you could. That's a different tutorial altogether. In here, these are presets. These are sets from different things I've done. And in fact, if we had like 10 of these flowers and we liked what we had here, you would come over here to presets. You would come down here to this little page guy, and you could choose everything you wanted applied to those 10 sets of flowers. So, I mean, you could just type in yellow flower. If you want to apply everything we just did to our fictional set of flowers that we're pretending we have for the next 10 seconds, then you would leave this all selected. If you just wanted a few, you would just select some of it. Sharpening, I turn off. The reason being is because the same amount of sharpening does not always work for every photograph. So then I would hit OK, and then the next time I opened my next flower or my next several flowers, I could come here, to this tab right here, the sliders, and select yellow flower, and it would do all of the editing we just did for us automatically, and all you'd have to go do is sharpen. So it's really nice. And so now the next thing that we would want to do, I use the ProPhoto RGB space. It's definitely what I recommend. It's going to show you a lot of things. If you needed to change that though, depending on what your project is, depending on who you're doing it for, you have Adobe, you have Color Match, you have ProPhoto, and you have sRGB. I prefer ProPhoto because it gives you the fullest color gamut you can possibly have. So now, instead of just hitting Open Image, we're actually going to hit Shift, and then the Open Image button becomes Open Object. The reason this is important, click that. It's going to switch us over to Photoshop. The reason the Object button is important is because it opens it in Photoshop as what's called a smart object. And you can tell if your image is a smart object because it's got this little doohickey down here, this little icon in the corner. And what that does is if I need to go back and fix some bridge adjustments later, when I come back to finish this later, I just mouse over the Smart Object thumbnail and double click on it, and it takes me right back to bridge, and I can do whatever I need, and then I hit OK, and it loads my adjustments if I were to adjust something back into my Photoshop image, and I can just go from there. So that is some just extremely basic, not very complicated. It's just a good place to start bridge editing, and hopefully just to give you kind of a handle on how bridge works with all its crazy sliders. And the next time we take a look at this photograph, we will be looking at the Photoshop editing process I use and setting it up to be converted to a black and white. Have a great day and cheers!